Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Brian Lee Crowley, the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a think tank. Believe it or not, we have a think tank in Canada, and he's the founder and head of this incredibly good think tank that I've had the privilege of interviewing several people from. And Brian, you've written some interesting pieces of late that maybe you're a little bit different than other people in the media have been arguing. One of them is you have argued that we actually need to get closer to the United States. Well, a lot of people are arguing we need to diversify our interests. Let's talk about that if we could. I think in it, your comment was the best response to Trump is not to lose our heads, but to keep our powder dry. Explain, please, sir.
So, look, I think the place to start with is we are in America's neighborhood. We are right next door. We are not right next door to anybody else. Everybody else is thousands of miles away. This matters. If you talk to economists about what are the things that determine who people trade with and so on, they'll tell you 80% of it is geography. 20% of it is free trade agreements and other kinds of trade arrangements. So if Canada, which is an incredibly trade-dependent country. We export 1/2 of everything we make in the private sector. And 85% of that goes to the United States. Even if we manage to shift some important part of that, let's say 10% or 15%, we'd still be sending 70% of all our exports to the United States. There is no alternative for Canada to a close relationship with the United States. And we have had close relationships with the United States with free trade agreements. We've had close relationships with the United States without free trade agreements. Donald Trump's only going to be there for 4 years. Our relationship with the United States is determined by geography, history, language, and a whole series of other things that has bound us together for centuries. And we will get past Donald Trump too. So I think this idea that we can easily somehow unhook ourselves from the United States and, join the EU or, become a vassal of China or something, these are completely fanciful ideas, Brian.
So when Mark Carney stands up and says that Trump has fundamentally changed the international trading order, I heard one of the main leaders of Singapore just 2 days ago made a major speech about this is a major change in 80 years of post-World War history. When President Macron stands up and says something fairly similar, they're wrong?
Well, I'm not saying that Trump isn't shifting the international trade order. I think he is. I'm talking about what kind of relationship Canada should have with the United States. Okay, now it's within that international trade order, but I think people get distracted by Donald Trump. Donald Trump's an incredible showman, and he loves to distract people with, explosive actions that seem to portend huge changes. But then when push comes to shove, he actually is not trying to upend everything the way that he claims he is. Look, let's go back for a second and talk about the renegotiation of NAFTA under the first Trump presidency. You might remember that Trump came to power saying, NAFTA is the worst trade agreement in the world. I'm going to rip it up. I'm going to tear everything down. This is straight out of Trump's playbook in The Art of the Deal. He says in so many words, my negotiating strategy is to convince everybody I am the craziest man in the room. And if they don't do what I want, I'm going to tear everything down. And then people play his game. He threatens to tear everything down. They say, oh my God, he's going to tear everything down. We better give him what he wants. Canada actually sat down, negotiated calmly with him. In the last Trump presidency, we got CUSMA instead of NAFTA, so we put a new name on it. But I got to tell you, you got to look really close at those two agreements to see the differences, Brian. And I think that's a lesson we should learn about Trump, is he wants to scare us into sitting down and negotiating. But the important thing for him is to reach a deal so that he can say, I did this. I put my name on it. This is not NAFTA. This is CUSMA. This is where we are now with him in his second Trump presidency. I do not, frankly, see the evidence that he's trying to destroy CUSMA or anything. In fact, if you look at what he's done in terms of tariffs, he's basically exempted almost the entirety of the trade that takes place under CUSMA from his tariffs. So I think we have to look carefully at what he's doing and not be so distracted by what he's saying. They're not the same thing.
So David Frum, writing in the Atlantic and in numerous different speeches, has said people got to start listening to Donald Trump. He's been arguing for tariffs since 1987. He took a full-page ad out in the New York Times arguing for tariffs against Japan and South Korea in 1987. That he has argued on numerous occasions that the golden era of the United States was the 1880s, 1890s, when there was no income tax and it was tariffs that was financing the U.S. government. David Frum takes a different point of view, that we got to start listening to Trump and believing what he says rather than dreaming that he's going to change. You disagree, obviously.
Well, you see, I think that Donald Trump may have in the back of his mind the idea that he's going to have what we used to call in the 19th century a revenue tariff. David's quite correct that actually tariffs used to be a main source of income for many countries around the world, including the United States. But what he's signaling is, maybe he's going to settle at a 10% general tariff. 10%, is not the end of the world. And by the way, Trump tariffs are their own punishment. We keep saying to Donald Trump and everybody who will listen to us in the United States, look, if you put tariffs on Canada, Canadians don't pay those tariffs. Americans pay those tariffs. It doesn't matter who signs the check to the American government. The Americans pay it in terms of higher costs, aluminum, steel, whatever. Those things go into American products, and American consumers have to buy them. And if the people they buy them, these raw materials from, have to pay a tariff, then it just gets passed on to the consumer. So, one of our arguments has been, we shouldn't respond to Trump's tariffs. And in fact, the vast majority of countries around the world have not responded with retaliatory tariffs because they want to negotiate the elimination of tariffs with Donald Trump. And this is why he says, I've been getting calls from 70 countries looking to negotiate open tariff-free relationships between, themselves and the United States. And I think this is where he wants to get. If he ends up with a 10% revenue tariff, I think that's bad for American consumers. I think ultimately he'll be forced to abandon it. Should we set our hair on fire over that? I don't think so. And so far, he hasn't applied it to Canada. So I think our established relationship with the United States has actually stood us in good stead, even in the face of Trump.
In the article that you wrote that I read, you made that argument well in regards to aluminum, and that Quebec has a comparative advantage because of cheap electricity, and that the Americans can't get aluminum production cost efficiently up and running in the United States. But what about this Ford plant in Ingersoll that's closed down? What about this plant, this Chrysler plant in Windsor that's closed down? And all of them are saying that it's the tariffs, that they're no longer economic in the United States. And so, maybe the consumer pays if they still keep buying the product, if the demand for the product is inelastic or there's no substitution. But if we price ourselves out of the market after the imposition of the tariff such that people aren't going to buy, aren't we going to have a negative impact on employment and production in Canada?
Very important point that you're raising, Brian. What I'd say in response is, the North American auto industry, let's take that concrete example, is deeply integrated on both sides of the border. Now, what Trump wants to do is he wants to pull the entire production process back into the United States. He somehow thinks Canada has stolen automobile jobs from America, which is rubbish. But this is what he believes. The fact of the matter is that the automobile industry, because it is so integrated, has never organized itself so that it can get all the parts it needs to make a car within the United States. It needs to be able to have access to plants and production capacity that has been created in Canada, because this is, there isn't there isn't spare capacity in the United States just sitting there waiting for someone to ask them to produce car parts, right? The North American industry has built its capacity. It's on both sides of the border, and the reason the car industry is slowly shutting down is not because tariffs are preventing Canadians from selling to the United States. It's because the entire production capacity of the auto industry is disrupted by what Trump is doing. And one of the reasons he keeps threatening things and then pulling back, threatening things and then pulling back, is because when he raises this specter, the automobile industry says to him, you know what? If you shut the border to this bilateral trade that's been going on for decades and on which we depend, you're going to shut down the entire car industry. There is just no way that America can suddenly create out of nothing the ability to build entire cars and dispense with the productive capacity that's been created in both Canada and Mexico. So Trump, again, he's operating on the basis of assumptions that he's made that are not based in facts. And the auto industry, amongst others, keeps coming back to him and saying, if you continue this way, that we are going to have to shut down production. And he keeps backing up. So, he keeps bumping into reality. And I think this is one of our best friends.
I've heard numerous economists talk about $2,500 to $3,000 increases in cars. In your article, you said that Philip Cross, a former chief economist at Stats Canada, says that it's a $12,000 increase in cars.
Yep. Well, back to the idea that tariffs are their own punishment. You see, even if America had the capacity to produce cars sourcing all of the parts from within the United States, assembling it all within the United States, transporting it, even if they could do that, they would have to spend a lot more money than they're spending now, because parts of the industry have gone to places where these things can be done more cheaply.
But the whole rationale that he's got is to bring manufacturing back to the United States.
Yes, but Brian, it takes years and billions of dollars of investment to create that capacity. You can't create it with a magic wand. His problem is he wants something that'll take a decade to create, and he wants it now. It's not going to happen.
In my day job, I do a fair amount of business in Texas and Florida and Kansas. The biggest issue that I hear is hiring people. They can't get workers.
I'm completely with you. I spend the month of January down on the U.S. Gulf Coast in Alabama, and there's help wanted signs everywhere. They're desperate for workers. The idea that there's this vast army of unemployed Americans, just waiting for the new car parts plant to open in their community, I think is a bit fanciful. Now, there are communities that have been devastated by globalization and offshoring and all that stuff, but to change this, the plants that have been shut down, to replace them, the capital investment that's needed, this takes years and years to create, Brian, not something that can be done overnight.
So the argument about tit for tat on tariffs, so the argument that the only way you stand up to a bully is by slapping him back. You in your article talk about Ford and the tariff on electricity that it had to back off on within 24 hours. None of that tit for tat. You agree with it? It's just give in, do whatever he wants.
Well, it's not give in. I know that's the way. You see, the thing is that people have a completely understandable emotional reaction to Donald Trump. He seems like this terrible bully with a big stick who's just sticking us to us because we've, in good faith, allowed ourselves to become deeply intertwined with the American economy on the understanding that, we had a free trade agreement. And so this was a reasonable arrangement on both sides. But the problem is, because We are so dependent on trade with the United States, and that trade cannot be easily shifted to somewhere else. In fact, I would make the argument it can't be shifted full stop. It's not just that, oh, well, with a little more effort, we could shift it. I think this is a completely wrong-headed way to think about it. The Canadian economy is not some separate entity that produces a bunch of stuff and then sells it to Americans and could choose not to sell it to Americans, but sell it to Europeans or Asians or something. No, Canada and the United States share a common, unified, continental economy that happens to fall under the political jurisdictions of two countries. That doesn't make the Canadian economy some separate entity from the United States economy and the continental trade. This is a completely wrong way of thinking about our economy in Canada. So, given this degree of dependence and interconnectedness between Canada and the United States, America has a lot more capacity to harm us because they hardly depend on trade at all. About 25% of their economy depends on trade. As I've already said, we export 50% of everything we make in the private sector, the vast bulk of it to the United States. Their capacity to hurt us vastly exceeds our capacity to hurt them. The idea that we can bring them to their knees by sticking it to them with tough tariffs and so on is completely illusory, Brian.
Okay. So we just don't increase the tariffs. And we hope and pray that we can win another negotiation, I guess.
Well, you see, I think we have things that we can do. I don't think tariffs are the answer. As you say, I pointed out that Doug Ford had to back off within 24 hours of his threatened tariff on electricity because America just said, "You think you can hurt us? We're going to hurt you a lot worse." So you see, that's not the right strategy. The right strategy, in my view, is to say to the United States, "Look, there are a lot of things that you want from us. You want us to spend more money on defense. You want us to be more active in protecting Arctic sovereignty. You want us to better manage the border. You want us to control immigration. You want us to do a whole bunch of things. We're willing to sit down with you and look at all of those things and see how we can put together a deal that is actually action on all those things that I mentioned are in Canada's interests." This is not us knuckling under the United States and doing things we don't want to do because America asked. These are things that we have fallen down on doing and we should be doing a better job on. If we want to sit down with America and say, "Hey, we'll do a better job on this. It's good for Canada. It's good for you. And by the way, part of the price of our doing these things is that we want, to be exempted from all of your trade shenanigans and so on." Fair enough. And I think that Trump is open to that. That's exactly what Trump loves. He loves to make a big deal. And I think Canada should sit down and negotiate a grand bargain with the United States. There is no alternative for us to our relationship with the United States. Let's make it better, not worse.
So in 1988, in the debate, and I'm going to paraphrase this, John Turner said to Brian Mulroney, "You're giving up our economic sovereignty, and once you give up our economic sovereignty, eventually you'll give up our political sovereignty." What you're arguing now is that effectively we have to agree with a whole bunch of things that the United States wants just to keep our economic relations.
Well, but the point is, Brian, that all of these things that I've mentioned that the Americans want, I think, are also good for Canada.
Those are things that you think are good for Canada, but
yeah.
So far, Canada hasn't agreed to them. Maybe we should have, but we haven't. And so what we're doing, you're suggesting, is agreeing with the Americans. We're giving up our sovereignty to them, are we not?
No. You see, sovereignty is an instrument to use to get what you want. Sovereignty is not some abstract thing that exists, in some platonic universe, untouched and unused. Sovereignty is what you use at the negotiating table. You offer things in exchange for things you want.
So was John Turner right or wrong in 1988 when he said, if you give up your economic sovereignty, you give up your political sovereignty?
He was completely wrong on both counts. He was wrong that we were giving up our economic sovereignty. We didn't have economic sovereignty for the reasons that I've already laid out. We do not have economic sovereignty in Canada. We are part of an integrated continental economy. There is no choice about that. There is no uncoupling from it. There is no alternative. That's it. There is no economic sovereignty for Canada, and anybody who tells you differently doesn't know what they're talking about. Political sovereignty is what you use, you negotiate with your political sovereignty to protect the economic vulnerability that interdependence creates. So I think it was wrong on both counts.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Brian Lee Crowley and talk about politics and the current election campaign that we're in, and his argument that that Pierre Poilievre's got to get closer to Washington and that victory runs through Washington. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. What a great conversation we're having tonight with Brian Lee Crowley, who is the managing director, founder of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a think tank in Ottawa. And I've had the honor of interviewing many of his smart people to work with him. Brian, you've written a couple of articles and you've done a couple of podcasts I've seen talking about the conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, and you've argued that his path to victory goes through Washington. The campaign manager for Doug Ford has effectively said that it's been campaign suicide, effectively, that he's focused on the last 10 years of Trudeau and Axe the Tax and running a campaign consistent with the arguments that would have made sense maybe last fall rather than changing and I guess following your strategy. And there's been a couple of articles that you've undoubtedly read that talk about these, large rallies that he's been having, and that they've only been speaking to the core, and the core actually like Trump. And so, therefore, whenever he talks about Trump and criticizes Trump, the people in the echo chamber in the rallies stop applauding and quiet down. So, what's your strategy for Pierre Poilievre to achieve victory?
Well, I think everything hinges on the so-called ballot question. In other words, the idea that when people go into the voting booth, their vote is an answer to a question that they ask themselves. And I think that the ballot question up until about 3 or 4 months ago was, do you want to keep going with Justin Trudeau as prime minister? And clearly, the answer was an overwhelming no. This is why Pierre enjoyed a 25% advantage in the polls, because the answer to that question was no. But the arrival of Mark Carney and the arrival of Trump has, in my view, completely changed the question that people are asking themselves. I think the question people are asking themselves is, who is best position to defend the interests of Canada in the era of Donald Trump? Once Trudeau left, the whole issue about, do you endorse the last 10 years of Liberal government and so on, or do you want change, I think was answered at least in part. Carney is some form of change, even within the Liberal Party. So I think the power of the change agenda, which Pierre Poilievre was putting forward, has completely lost its purchase on the minds of people. So if the ballot question, if I'm right about this, if the ballot question is, who's best positioned to defend Canada against the danger posed by Donald Trump, then my view is that Pierre has to stop with carbon tax, Carney stuff. I just think this just doesn't resonate with people at all. He has to position himself as someone who can stand up to Donald Trump, who understands what's going on in Washington, and is capable of responding to the challenge that the Trump presidency represents. And what I suggested in the piece I wrote was not that he should go down to Washington and sit down with Donald Trump. I think that would be a mistake. He shouldn't go down and try and ingratiate himself with Donald Trump. On the contrary, he should go down and, in front of a think tank audience, or, it would be easy for him to get an audience in Washington that would be quite interested in what he would have to say. And he should say, look, I'm running to be the Prime Minister of Canada. I'm here to tell you that if I win the election, these are the things I'm going to do to protect Canada's interests. And this is what I expect in return from an American administration that cares about its relationship with Canada. I think that would really change in a lot of ways the ways that people think about Pierre Poilievre and how he might fill the job of prime minister.
In your article, you said that his strategy has been to avoid being in the United States. Presumably, you say on the grounds that any popularity Poilievre might enjoy with the American right would be used against him in Canada. The new political situation changes his calculus radically, however. Poilievre now needs to neutralize the charge that he is a thinly disguised MAGA Republican in snowshoes. Yep. On Saturday morning, Pierre Poilievre tweeted out that Matt Gaetz had endorsed him. Elon Musk has endorsed him. Numerous different Americans have said positive things about him from the MAGA right. Is that positive or negative?
Well, I'm not a political strategist. They must have reasons why they want to do that. I personally think that what Canadians are looking for is somebody who can clearly articulate what Canada's interests are in the current circumstances. People are afraid. They hear all kinds of disturbing things coming out of Washington. They don't understand them. They worry that Canada is vulnerable. They need reassurance that whoever is going to be the Prime Minister of Canada understands Canada's interests and is well able to defend them in the United States. I think if Pierre Poilievre comes across as someone who is close to the MAGA Republican right, I don't think that will serve him well in Canada in a federal election. He needs to be the guy who, as he did when Donald Trump said of him, Pierre's no MAGA guy, and Pierre said, "You're absolutely right. I'm a Canada First guy. I am not a MAGA guy." I think that was the right messaging. I'm not the guy to tell him whether he's doing the right thing or not in parroting his endorsement by various figures in the MAGA movement.
What's Mark Carney got to do?
Well, he seems to be doing pretty well. I think his great vulnerability, and I think this is one of the reasons why his handlers try and keep him away from the media and so on as much as they can, is he's rather thin-skinned and kind of a touch authoritarian, and he likes to tell people, who are you to ask me a question like this? I think he comes across as very brittle, and I don't think this is a good look for him, and it's certainly something that Donald Trump is going to look at and think, look, this guy is a Davos technocrat who thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. I've eaten 1,000 guys like this for breakfast. I personally don't think that Mark Carney is projecting the right kind of image for dealing with Donald Trump, if that's going to be the ballot question. But I can't say that Pierre is doing a better job. So Mark Carney seems to be somewhat ahead in the polls, and I think that's the reason why.
Brian Lee Crowley, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your point of view on this topic.
Great to talk to you, Brian. I'm
going to take a break and come back with my own views on where the election campaign is and how to deal with the United States in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.